Welcome to The Gaze. I'm Henry Keane and this is my show, Talk for More. I'm so very glad to meet you here on a digital platform of a new Europe. A space where we'll be finding and highlighting all of the most significant events in the region for you, and we'll speak about it with the best of experts. Today we will talk about one of the key events in 2023 for us and for the whole of the world, the G7 summit. Meeting of the world leaders took place in Hiroshima in Japan. It seems to me, as well as to most of the world leading experts, that the last G7 summit was extremely effective for Ukraine. Volodymyr Zelenskyy arrived at Hiroshima on 20th of May on a President of France ordered board, and during 2 days met with all leaders of G7 in tete-a-tete meetings and had a speech at the working session of the summit. You see, our president, without any reverence or exaggeration, did a great job. A week before the summit, he made a visit to Europe. In 3 days, he visited Italy, Germany, France, and Great Britain. A week before the summit, Volodymyr Zelenskyy has previously highlighted, discussed, and what is of most importance, agreed with all European countries upon Ukraine's stance in terms of the questions that are vital to us, to our survival, made sure in Europe's understanding and support, all politically, military, and economically, and brought this support and understanding right to the summit of G7. Also, one thing that should not go unnoticed. The day before arriving to Hiroshima's G7, where we could hope on all the support, Zelenskyy took part in the Arab League summit. This is an event, a meeting, where countries gather that do not really support Ukraine, as well as all the other Western world. Nevertheless, these are the countries that have their fair share of influence on the world in general and Russia in particular. And so, Zelenskyy comes over and explains and shows respect and understanding, even in place where little understanding and respect are shown in return. It is plain to see Zelensky's 2 working weeks outside Ukraine meant global shifts in world politics. Don't forget, skies are closed here in Ukraine, in terms that civil jets of any kind just do not fly over Ukraine. So to do any visit anywhere in the world, you must first go to neighboring Poland. And this adds up at least 7 or 8 hours for a one-way trip, so doubly for any back trip. And all this security, procedures and protocols in times of war, believe me or not, they are exhausting and dangerous. I'm not at all saying this is something heroic, no. Our men and women, our boys and girls in the trenches to spill their blood for Ukraine, they are heroes. But Zelenskyy adds up to it. He shows that our people's heroism is not in vain. Zelenskyy is simply doing what a president in times of war should do. Makes the necessary trips, whether it is hostile Bakhmut front line or not very positive in relation to Ukraine, Arab summit or G7 summit of the most influential leaders of the world. Zelenskyy is there, explaining, convincing with the facts and his charisma. These are presidential duties, and Zelenskyy simply does the job. And Ukraine benefits from that, and that is why I call that kind of job great. For example, in Hiroshima, decisions were made that would determine the West's strategy at least until the end of the year. And Ukraine has, if not a key role, then at least its important place in the West's strategy. The very first point of the G7 final communiqué has it, to support Kiev as much as it will be necessary. And the President of the European Council, Charles Michel, directly calls on China to put pressure on Russia. The leaders of the world also made a separate joint statement regarding Ukraine. It includes support for Zelenskyy's peace formula, assistance to Ukraine during the war and in reconstruction, which is very important, also strengthening of sanctions, in particular on diamonds, and further economic isolation of the Russian Federation. It is also said and established that the G7 will make all effort to make Russia compensate all damages its criminal aggression against Ukraine has done. And the world should not and would not let Kremlin's war crimes go unpunished. This means that any rumors that are heard from now and then, oh, West is ready to abandon us, stop its aid right after our successful counteroffensive and force us to an unjust truce with Russia are nothing but also pro-Russian attempts to misinform and disorient us as a nation and our partners. Look at the bare facts. It is the strategic narrative of the West, full and fair victory for Ukraine. There are no retreats, no halts, no by-the-way stops. There are no attempts to cheapen all that has been done by Ukraine, and that is an unspeakable, enormous amount of efforts, blood, death and courage, ruined infrastructure, hundreds of thousands of dead, military, civilians and children, hundreds of children killed, and no one in the West is trying to devalue that and make us reconcile with Russia. And G7 clearly shown that. Moreover, during the G7 summit in Hiroshima, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres stated that UN Security Council is not fulfilling its main functions for which it had been created. There is a major flaw in the system of international security, and that flaw is Russia. A state that simply disregards all international laws and still possesses veto power within the UN Security Council, a state that has unleashed the largest war in Europe since 1945, the year the Security Council was created, just by the way. Russia holds the chair in the United Nations and is being a permanent member of the Security Council illegally. This chair belonged to USSR and procedurally cannot have passed to Russia just like that, but it did. So today Russia should be expelled from the United Nations, and its further re-accession to this organization should be considered according to the appropriate procedure. The very statement of the UN Secretary General sends a clear signal to the Council's awareness of the problems that Kyiv has long been declaring at highest levels. Perhaps it is this war that will lead to restructurizing, reconstructing the global security architecture, turning it into a modern and effective and adequate one. In addition to political decisions to be implemented in short or long-term future, the G7 summit also produced very practical and immediate results. F-16s fighter jets for Ukraine. On the eve of Zelenskyy's visit, an aviation coalition led by Britain and the Netherlands began to form, and the United States finally agreed to train Ukrainian pilots and gave the green light for the supply of aircraft. For the world leaders, the summit was an opportunity to coordinate the actions of partners and to make sure of the political support of the whole idea. It's more than that, actually. At the meeting in Hiroshima, leaders were searching for a future security model for Ukraine. Speaking to all G7 leaders, Zelenskyy said it plainly and clear. Ukraine is waiting for clear signals at the Vilnius NATO summit in July and also needs to receive security guarantees before becoming a member of the alliance. The security model is the number one issue after military matters, of course, and NATO is the only option for us. The NATO countries represented in the G7 are the most influential members of the alliance, and it was extremely important to convey to them the Ukrainian stance for security on the eve of the summit in Vilnius. Just as Zelenskyy's European tour was a preparation for the G7, so the backroom meetings of the G7 are preparations for summit in Vilnius. However, before the NATO summit in Vilnius, another large international event is about to happen: Peace Summit in Copenhagen. It is planned for the beginning of July, before the very meeting of NATO. Therefore, the countries will still have the opportunity to correlate their positions once again, both publicly and behind closed doors. Just to remind you, at the dates the Peace Summit is about to be held, an anniversary is coming. 500 days of Ukrainian resilience in the face of the way biggest enemy aggression. Remember, Russia and some Western analysts said that the war will end in 3 days. Well, as bare facts clearly show us today, they were mistaken at least 200 times. But what is more important, they were dead wrong about who would win this war. The world has no doubts anymore these days, and its support for Ukraine does not decrease. And amongst the first to help, give, train and support us in times of war is Great Britain. Britain these days is one of the drivers of active support for Ukraine, and today We will talk about the politics and other things happening in Great Britain and many things more in terms of its societal attitude to itself, Ukraine-Russia war, politics and economy. I'm very happy to give you our guest, Mr. Tyler Kustra, an assistant professor of politics and international relations at the University of Nottingham, where his research focuses on economic sanctions and political violence. Tyler Kustra previously occupied a position of an economic advisor to the Parliament of Canada. Good day, Tyler. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Ukrainian President Zelenskyy held a number of meetings with world leaders during the G7 summit in Hiroshima, Japan. It is plain to see Ukraine has a key role in West strategy, at least until the end of the year. It is the first point of the G7 final communique to support Kiev as much as it may be necessary, as I just already said before. The leaders also made a separate joint statement regarding Ukraine. It includes support for Zelenskyy's peace formula assistance to Ukraine during the war and in the post-war reconstruction aftermath, strengthening of sanctions and economic isolation of the Russian Federation, further isolation, as part of a working visit to Japan to participate in the G7 summit. President Zelenskyy held a meeting with Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Rishi Sunak. Zelenskyy thanked the Prime Minister for the United Kingdom's leadership in the international fighter jet coalition, and the parties also discussed the further implementation of the previously reached agreements during the visit of the President of Ukraine to the United Kingdom on May 14th. Zelenskyy and Sunak exchanged views on the development of bilateral relations between Ukraine and the United Kingdom, and recently Sunak said that the West's support for Kiev may last for years. Such a confidence, isn't that overconfidence? Maybe. Where from? What I mean is, where is the source and what is the source of such a confidence? What do you think?
I think the reason the West is giving so much support to Ukraine is both because we see the unwarranted Russian aggression to a peaceful country, and because we know that if Ukraine falls, then Russia will be on the borders of Poland, Russia will be on the borders of Romania, Russia will be on the borders of the EU. And we don't think that Vladimir Putin's aggression will just stop if he takes Kyiv. This is a bloodthirsty man, and we need to show a strong message to him now, to stand up to him now, and not leave it until he starts menacing Poland or menacing Romania or menacing other EU countries.
So are you telling me that the collective West is sharing your opinion? Are you absolutely certain in that?
I think the Western leaders understand the importance of defending Ukraine. I think the Western people see how bravely the Ukrainians are fighting, see how vicious the Russians can be, and have great sympathy for people who are standing up, fighting for their homes, fighting for their wives, fighting for their children.
But such a confidence for years.
Well, if necessary, for years, to quote Winston Churchill. I think that there is amongst the elites in Europe an understanding of how dangerous Putin is, amongst the people, sympathy for what the Ukrainian people are going through. I would hope it could go on for years. What I have to say about Zelenskyy is that this man is a rock star. You know, everyone wants to take their photo with Zelenskyy. No one wants to take their photo with anyone else as much as him. So long as he keeps up this level of popularity, Europe will be willing to go and keep on supplying Ukraine. Ukraine's media relations here is going to be written about for decades. And the ability of Zelenskyy to influence public opinion is the last person I saw do it that well was Barack Obama.
Boris Johnson, after February 24th, he was amongst those first of high-rank politicians of the world to visit Kyiv. In less than a month after his appointment, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Rishi Sunak, comes to Kyiv, as you probably know. It very much looks like Ukraine is playing a key role in British politics, and obviously Britain's political establishment is at Ukraine's side quite firmly and adaptedly. My question is, why exactly? Or let me fine-tune my question to you as an expert. What is the driving force of the phenomenon? Of course, the war, but maybe something else.
I think that there's both an understanding amongst the elite that Ukraine is on the front lines, that Ukraine is effectively the border of the West, and that we do not want Ukraine to fall. That would be bad for us. That would be bad for NATO if Ukraine were to fall, and NATO would have a much longer border with Russia. So there's certainly support amongst the elite, and then amongst the general public. We just see the atrocities that the Russian soldiers are committing. We see how much the Ukrainian people are suffering, and we're very sympathetic to making sure that Ukraine has the ability to defend herself against bloody Russian aggression.
Thank you very much for your answer. Great Britain was the first to announce it's providing Ukraine with heavy armor, Challenger 2 tanks. And England is one of the first who talked about modern fighter jets for our military. Great Britain will start training Ukrainian pilots on F-16 already this summer. This was stated by Prime Minister Rishi Sunak during a press conference at the G7 summit. He emphasized that his country supports the defense of Ukraine and its righteous defense against criminal Russian aggression. Mr. Sunak also said that, I quote, "Ukraine's security is our security." Prime Minister welcomed, I quote again, "very tangible progress in providing further support achieved at the meeting of the leaders of the G7 countries, primarily the support of the US President Joseph Biden for an international coalition of countries to provide Ukraine with advanced fighter jets." The United Kingdom and the world look really united these days when it comes to Ukraine. The fact that President Zelenskyy stands side by side with his G7 allies sends a very clear and very direct signal to Russia and the world that the world is united around President Volodymyr Zelenskyy and the Ukrainian people and will continue to support him and his nation for as long as it might be necessary.
I want to pay tribute to my friend Vladimir. It was a privilege to welcome him to Chequers earlier this week, and I believe his attendance at this G7 was a moment of historic significance. The image of the G7 and our partners standing shoulder to shoulder with President Zelenskyy sends a powerful message about the unity and determination of the G7 allies. We will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes, because their security is our security. The G7 strategy is clear. Our military, diplomatic and economic tools are all part of the Ukrainian counter-offensive. We're delivering more support on the battlefield through air defence, artillery, tanks and long-range missiles, which the UK was the first country to provide.
But it is not only heavy armour on the ground. Let us not forget the fire from the skies. Great Britain sends Storm Shadows for our Ukrainian army. Ben Wallace stated that the use of the Storm Shadow missiles will allow Ukraine to push back Russian forces from the sovereign territory of Ukraine. Moreover, and I consider it a very important sub-message that should not go unnoticed, according to Minister Wallace, the United Kingdom was evaluated and has evaluated the risk of escalation in connection with the transfer of Storm Shadow's missiles to Ukraine and knows exactly how to minimize it. With that much said, and with that much of help, is Great Britain not afraid that all this support might be coming a great deal at the cost of detriment of its own combat capability? What do you think as an expert?
So I think it's important to go and deter the enemy at the front. I don't think that going and saying we're going to let Vladimir Putin run over Ukraine and then run over Poland, and eventually when he comes to get us, then we'll go and defend ourselves. I think it's wonderful that we're able to stop the Russians in eastern Ukraine rather than waiting until they come on our shores. So in fact, by giving these missiles, by giving this technology to Ukraine, it allows them to take the fight to our mutual adversary. It actually benefits our security by arming Ukraine.
Well, a sub-question. Do you think that in the collective mind of, say, British society, any parallels with World War II are drawn? What I mean is, does British society feel that in Putin's Russia's face, in the Kremlin's face, Ukraine is fighting the enemy of the whole progressive world, and by supporting Ukraine, Britain does the same? Is that the case?
Yeah, I think there's a very large concern about Vladimir Putin's behavior. I think he's shown himself to be hostile to the West, to be hostile to Ukraine, to be hostile to the United States, to be hostile to British interests. And I think there's a tremendous amount of sympathy in the British people when they see the war crimes and the atrocities that the Russian military has committed. And they start to draw parallels and they say, look, we have sympathy for the Ukrainian people. We know how dangerous Putin is. It's time to go and stop him in Ukraine. They draw parallels to their resistance to the Nazis during the Second World War.
Great Britain announced a ban on Russian diamonds, all right, and imports of metals from Russia, including, you name it, copper, aluminum, and nickel, in support of Ukraine. The UK has also announced a new wave of sanctions against Russia, targeting businesses and individuals connected to Russia's capacity to fund and wage the war. The 86 designations target individuals and organizations connected to Russia's energy, metals, defense, transport, and financial sectors, ramping up pressure on Putin's remaining revenue and his attempts to use these sectors to support the Kremlin's military machine. My question is, why so late? What, in your expert opinion, could have held up such an obviously necessary decision for so long?
Well, I think mainly the Russian trade with Europe was selling oil and natural gas to the EU. If you look at that, Europe was sending almost €1 billion a day at points to the Kremlin for oil and gas. That's ended now. That's the major supply of Putin's foreign currency from Europe. What the UK had minor trade with Russia to begin with. The diamond trade was not that big and important. And while I think it should have been done sooner, if you look at what they were concentrating on, they were concentrating on the big fish, the big trade. And they're now doing a little mop-up operation of smaller things to announce a year and a bit into the war.
Do you believe sanctions are working, actually?
I believe sanctions are causing Vladimir Putin to have to make decisions, to have to make trade-offs. How much money does he want to spend propping up his rule in Russia? How much money can he spend on the war, right? Every dollar that we keep Russia from getting, every dollar we keep the Kremlin from getting is a dollar that Putin can't use. I don't have exact figures on how much damage sanctions have done to the Russian economy. Vladimir Putin is not a man to be trusted. And frankly, we don't have any good economic data coming out of Russia. But what I can say anecdotally is the Russian economy is having great difficulty being able to cope with both providing a good standard of living for the Russian people and providing tanks and guns to the Russian army. So Putin's stuck in a trade-off. He can't have it all, and these sanctions mean that he has to make some sacrifices in his ability to wage war.
If that would be for you to decide, what sanctions would you propose?
I would propose a comprehensive set of sanctions on Russia. I obviously am in favor of very large energy sanctions. I'm in favor of banning financial transactions. I'm in favor of seizing the assets of some oligarchs. Most of those things are now in place. And so we're now starting to see actual pressure come on the Russian economy.
According to the Organised Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, there is quite a lot of property in London alone that belongs to Russians. I mean, these are even excursions when the mansions of Russian oligarchs are shown to the tourists, like a Grade 2 listed mansion in Wittenhouse, believed to be worth £300 million, about mind-boggling $361 million, and owned by Russian billionaire Andrei Guriev. Beechwood House, acquired by ex-Arsenal Football Club shareholder Alisher Usmanov in 2008 for £48 million. Next door is Atlan House, a £65 million mansion owned by the billionaire Mikhail Friedman. Almost £18 million property once owned by the son of Vladimir Yakunin, a former KGB colleague at Putin's. All these is real Russian estate in London that is literally standing there right very now. How come? I mean, all right, send them those Storm Shadows and Challenger tanks, but leave those poor Russian oligarchs alone. Or what? Does Russian money influence British politics that much? And how exactly does Russian money lobby itself in Great Britain? What do you think, as an expert?
Sure. So one, I don't want to talk about any specific individual. Sure. I just want to make that clear. But look, the Foreign Office, and I've had conversations with them, is working very hard to go and sanction Russian oligarchs. But our legal system here requires evidence, it requires procedure, and so in some cases this takes much longer than we would like. I can't speak to any of the particular individuals. What I can say is, those houses aren't going anywhere. You can't take a mansion in Belgravia and just jet off with it to another country. So even if it isn't frozen today, the UK government at some point will freeze access to those assets if that person has connections to Vladimir Putin.
I am very glad to hear that. On 4th March 2018, Sergei Skripal, a former Russian military officer and double agent for the British intelligence service, and his daughter Julia Skripal were poisoned in the city of Salisbury, England. According to the UK side, they were poisoned by means of a Novichok nerve agent. Both Sergei and Julia Skripal spent several weeks in hospital in a critical condition before being discharged. The British government accused Russia of attempted murder and announced a series of punitive measures against Russia, including the expulsions of Russian diplomats. The UK's official assessment of the incident was supported by 28 other countries, which responded in a similar way. Altogether, an unprecedented 153 Russian diplomats were expelled by the end of March 2018. Russia, of course, denied all the accusations and, as a mirror measure, expels foreign diplomats and, in turn, accused Britain of Skripal's poisoning. Was it the last straw for mutual official relationship between Russia and London? Did all these alarm bells and then the upcoming Kremlin's war against Ukraine, aggression against Ukraine, is that the end of Britain and Russian diplomacy as we know it? What do you think?
I think the poisoning was obviously a large black mark for Russia. I think we should have taken that more seriously than we did, insofar as it should have just indicated to us again how dangerous Vladimir Putin is, how much he cannot be trusted, how much we have to make sure that we don't give him the ability to hurt us. And I wish it had been taken more seriously, but we are where we are right now. And I think it's very good that we're now starting to wake up to the danger Putin poses. We're waking up to that. We're providing Ukraine with weapons. We're providing Ukraine with Storm Shadow missiles. We're providing Ukraine with fighter jet training so that Ukraine can defend itself against our mutual enemy.
Thank you very much for your detailed answer. Tyler, if you don't mind, let us talk about Brexit. I think, and most of the most prominent experts of the world and analysts think that the Brexit knocked down the United Kingdom's economy. Do you think that is the case?
I think we'll never be able to actually figure out the impact of Brexit because Brexit occurred almost at the same time as the coronavirus pandemic. And so we have two events that could both have a substantial economic impact occurring at the same time. It's not going to be possible to disentangle that.
Well, at least most of the official British and international analysts agree that it did knock down the British economy. According to these experts from the Office of Budget Responsibility, Britain will miss about 4% of economic growth in the midterm. Non-state forecasts are even gloomier, 6 to 7%. The nation is getting richer, but not as fast as it should. And that has its two main reasons. The first is described above, the reduction in inputs of goods, capital, and labor due to the exit from the single European market. The second reason is the reduction in exports. The EU single market gave the British access to the pockets of 500 million potential customers from Bulgaria and Germany to Cyprus and Portugal as if they were living next door. Brexit barriers to trade have cost the UK nearly 16% of its previous trade, as per calculation of the research institute CER. The economic damage is evident, but it is far away from the apocalypse that the opponents of the Brexit feared. At least two last prime minister shifts have economic backgrounds. Now, today, are citizens of the United Kingdom happy with the decision they have made back in 2016? How do the former businesses partners in Europe and the UK are doing now? Is there no desire to turn back the hands of time?
I think at this point, Brexit lasted so long. The debates on Brexit lasted so long. Remember, the referendum was in 2016, and then it took 3 years for Boris Johnson to come in and have a definitive decision on Brexit. I think at this point everyone is just exhausted from it. There isn't a majority of the British public who would want to revisit the issue. Maybe in 10 or 20 or 30 years. But for the moment, I would say that from the British public's perspective, Brexit is done and dusted.
To you, do you think it was the right thing to do, the Brexit, I mean?
I want to avoid answering that question because Brexit is still a contentious issue, and I'm more in favor of just coming out and saying good things about Ukraine than getting myself in a position where I take a stance on a divisive domestic political issue.
All right, I will ask another question, more or less not about Brexit. Many countries like Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine want to join. Well, of course, their economies are nothing even close like the Great Britain's, but what were the main reasons for the British nation and the British politics to be that much divided? Well, to me, radically different points of view on the country's future in terms of European Union and Brexit. What do you think? What's the reason for that?
I think there was some concern about EU law trumping British law, and that motivated some Brexiters. I think there was some concern about the free movement of people into Britain, and that also motivated some Brexiters. I think there's just, in some cases, a desire for the UK to be independent and aloof from Europe. I think continental Europe is much more in favor of integration than the UK would be. And finally, I would suggest that for countries whose economy is more developing, a country like Ukraine, Moldova, or Georgia, they would have larger benefits from joining the EU than for a country that has a well-developed service sector economy.
It is obviously that Ukraine is about to join European Union. To you as an expert, can you please say what exactly will have Ukraine when entering United Kingdom, European Union? Is it good for Ukraine? What it will do to its economy and politics?
It would be tremendous for Ukraine to become a member of the EU, right? That would allow Ukrainian businesses easier access to the largest and most lucrative market that's immediately on Ukraine's borders. Ukraine's manufacturers could easily export goods into Europe. You could integrate supply chains between Germany, Poland, Romania, and Ukraine. It would allow the free movement of labor, so Ukrainians who received jobs in the EU could move there without any paperwork. And finally, of course, the EU often supports some of its members with weaker economies. We've seen the damage to Ukraine that's been done by the war. Joining the EU would potentially provide Ukraine with substantial subsidies to help rebuild its economy.
Okay, a provocative question. In case the United Kingdom will still be in European Union by now, the country will vote for Ukraine to be joining European Union these days.
I really haven't thought of that. I really wouldn't know. The EU is so far in favor of not being in the EU. It hasn't been something I've considered.
All right. I will ask another question.
Yeah.
The markets of EU are quite tough and very well regulated. There are all sorts of regulations. Do you think it is good for Ukraine to enter European Union now with that much of regulations in these markets?
I think the regulations can often be a drag to businesses, but I also think that Ukraine is a natural trading partner for the EU. Right? Ukraine, unfortunately, doesn't have the same levels of capital that the rest of the EU has, but it has a tremendous amount. But then the reverse of that is it has a lot of labor that it could easily sell into that market. So it would immediately start to raise Ukrainian wages and raise them substantially. I know that some of the regulations can be onerous, but I think on net, the ability to enter the world's largest economy that's immediately on your doorstep is worth the extra paper.
So to use an expert, there are a lot of cons and a lot of pros. What's your choice?
I think the pluses overwhelm the cons. I think there are cons, but the pluses are just so large that it's like asking which is a larger number, 1 million or 5.
Exactly.
You know, I would say 1 million.
I read you. Yeah, well, this is the question of the whole new program. That's a question that can be asked and answered for hours. I believe that Ukraine at least deserves to be in European Union, and it deserved it with the blood of our people that are dying now, for example, in Bakhmut. Let's go to another question. Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Rishi Sunak held a meeting at the G7 summit. The two leaders are reported to have discussed a range of subjects, including the India-UK Free Trade Agreement, innovation, science, and the comprehensive strategic partnership between the two countries. Leaders agreed to deepen cooperation across a wide range of areas, such as trade and investment, science and technology, higher education, and people-to-people relationship. Usual agenda for an equal status partners. Do you believe the wounds of the past are healed by now, indeed, and a former empire and a former colony, which back in the days ensured the power of this very empire, can work now hand in hand these days?
I think that there's a lot of opportunities to strengthen UK-India relations. I think we've seen some of that go on. I think there is obviously some people who are still concerned about past history, but I think there's a lot of people who want to strengthen these relations, strengthen these ties now, and are less concerned about the UK's colonial history in England.
So, are you telling me that there is actually no choice, but UK and India has to work together hand in hand? Is that right?
I think there's a lot of people who want the UK and India to work together hand in hand, and I think their perspective trumps people who have historical aggravations against the UK. Overall, I think the UK, better relations with the UK is viewed positively in India, and greater relations with India is viewed positively in the UK.
But going back to G7 summit, it was a great summit results for Ukraine. When do you think, in terms of time, we can see actual results of it here in Ukraine, literally on the ground, the actual fighter jets here in Ukraine? Month, maybe more. What do you think?
I don't know. F-16s are obviously a fairly advanced fighter jet. You know, they're a 4.5 generation fighter jet. They are not the easiest thing to fly. And I think one of Ukraine's great benefits is it's been keeping its powder in reserve. It hasn't been engaging in suicidal offensives. And so I think Ukraine has been very patient. I'm very sympathetic to people living in Kyiv who would like this war to be over as soon as possible. But I think the general's idea of waiting until they're ready to attack is right. And if it takes 3 months or 4 months to get this together, then so be it. I want a Ukrainian offensive that wins, even if I have to wait another couple of weeks.
Greatest answer ever possible. G7 summit is not only about Ukraine. It's about the international relationship between G7 countries, the biggest countries of the world. How fast the results of this summit can be implemented into life, do you think?
I mean, it will take a certain amount of time to get Ukrainian pilots trained. I don't have any...
Yeah,
go ahead.
I'm sorry for interrupting you. I'm not talking about Ukraine. Like, for example, two prime ministers, Rishi Sunak and Narendra Modi. They met. They discussed the questions. But when do we see the results of this discussion actually to be implemented in life? Do you think it will take years, what it usually takes, or these days, in terms of what is happening in Ukraine, it can go faster? It's sort of a catalyst, Ukraine is the Ukraine warfare.
I would respectfully disagree on that. I think Ukraine is a priority item. And so things involving Ukraine are done just much, much faster because we know the dire situation the Ukrainian people are in, given this Russian aggression. I had a friend who works in the Canadian government when they were developing the visa for Ukrainians to come over to Canada, and they did that in record time. I think something like a trade agreement between the UK and India is nowhere close to as pressing and would take years, not days. I think Ukraine is just, if it has Ukraine on it, it goes to the top of the list in government.
My next questions. The countries of Indonesia, the global south, they are not part of G7, but they were there. Why?
Because the G7 is a wonderful place to get business done, and the G7 recognize that they're not the only countries in the world, and that there are other countries that are often good to have at those meetings, because it's a chance to bring all the world leaders together and hash things out. So this is why you'll see global south countries invited.
Which is actually very important, if you ask me.
Yes, yeah, it's good to have them there. You know, I think the G7 is somewhat of an anachronism. You know, it was founded during the Cold War. It was founded in a much different time, and this is why we've seen the G20 also become important.
Well, since you started that G20, what's to expect for Ukraine and the world in September's G20 summit?
I really don't know. I think right now our focus needs to be on getting Ukraine the weapons it needs. I think now that fighter jets are on the table, that's the final sort of ultimate weapon for Ukraine. Now that those are coming online, I think the most important thing is get those Ukrainian pilots trained, get Ukrainian air supremacy over Ukraine's territory and beat the Russians. I think right now Ukraine has gotten almost everything the West can give now that we've authorized fighter jets.
What about China?
What about China? I mean, China is obviously a malevolent actor on the world stage. At the same time, it understands that it has its own interests that are separate from Putin, and is learning a lot in this war about the dangers of going up against the West. You know, it's seen how bravely the Ukrainian people are fighting with American and European weapons, and it's having to recalculate whether or not it wants to attack Taiwan now, right?
Right.
You guys using that Storm Shadow, you guys using those missiles to take down that hypersonic Russian missile, that just didn't make Vladimir Putin concerned. That made Xi Jinping concerned. Western technology is simply superior to Russian technology and superior to Chinese technology. And this war has the benefit of making Xi Jinping recalculate whether or not he'll ever attack an American ally.
All right. In terms of what has been said today, I would love to ask you my favorite question that I'm asking all the experts that I meet. Putin, Vladimir Putin, as a person, bad or mad? Do you believe he's just a bad person and he wants he's greed for power and he's ready to do everything? Yes, but do you think that he's actually mad, or he's very rational in his own realm?
I mean, I can say he's certainly bad, and we can look at him being bad before COVID, when he was very evil and calculating. After COVID, I don't know. I hope that he's just bad, that he isn't mad. Julie Ioffe had an entire discussion saying, look, he walls himself off to avoid COVID, and he just goes crazy from the isolation. I hope she's wrong. I hope he's just bad. He might be mad.
In terms of nuclear?
In terms of nuclear, I don't think so. I think he might be crazy in terms of continuing to be in Ukraine. I think that this was a terrible decision on his part to start the war, but I don't think he's going to go nuclear, because I think he knows that if he does that, that's his last day in office.
I don't know if you would be able to answer that question, but I will still ask it. Do you think what Russia is able and willing to give, I mean the Kremlin, not Russia as a country, but the Kremlin and Putin's Russia, Putin's version of Russia, is ready to give to China to get help that it needs, military help, financial help, political help, any help from China?
I think the Chinese have been well warned by the American government that they should not assist Russia in this, that would have serious consequences. I am concerned that Chinese companies are building the weapons that are being used to kill Ukrainians, because the Russian military industrial capacity just isn't there. But I still think that China does not want to actually come out and publicly do a lot of this, because they know the consequences that they'll face. Insofar as Russia is turning to North Korea to build artillery shells, you don't phone North Korea until you're very desperate.
Yeah, absolutely. You're getting the same Russian shells, just outdated.
Yeah, but quality of North Korean manufacturing, this isn't Switzerland. They're not. Rolex is not making these shells. You know, they're desperate. Putin has himself in a corner.
I will make a statement, and you please say if you agree about it. Is Ukraine to the West the same as Russia to the China? Isn't that true or not?
No, because Russia's relationship with China is just so much different, right? Russia and China are two dictatorships each of whose dictator only cares about their own personal survival. Whereas the West sees Ukraine as a fellow democracy and wants to do what's right for Ukraine and is willing to, and is trustworthy. And we see Zelenskyy not as a Xi Jinping, but as a Winston Churchill.
Vladimir Putin and The Hague. Do you think this is going to happen? Is there any chance, a real chance, that Vladimir Putin will be sitting at the bench in The Hague and tried for all the criminal warfare, all the monstrosities and atrocities that he has done here and his army has done here in Ukraine? Do you think this is what is going to happen?
You know, I absolutely wish that would happen. I absolutely think he should be tried for his crimes against the Ukrainian people. But unfortunately, Putin, keeps power through fear. He knows that if he ever leaves the Kremlin, he'll be killed immediately. He knows the only way out is he's carried out in a box. Whether he's carried out because he dies of natural causes or whether he's carried out of there because the Russian people overthrow their brutal dictator, I do not know. But I think that there is very little chance of him ever leaving the Kremlin alive.
The other side of this question, do you think that responsibility for everything, for the atrocities of this warfare in Ukraine, is actually the Russian nation should be held accountable just as well as its Tsar, Vladimir Putin? Do you think that is the case? Do you think that is happening?
I'm friends with a lot of Russian dissidents, Russians who are just appalled by their government's behavior. And perhaps it's just the sample of people I know. But I don't necessarily think all Russians are responsible for this war. I think there is one particular Russian, Putin, who bears chief responsibility. And then his generals, the security services, those people bear responsibility. But I'm not sure that individual Russians who don't have the ability to stand up to Putin necessarily have moral culpability here. I think the culpability lies with the people who committed these actions, which is Putin and the Russian military.
Well, that is undoubtedly, yes. But Putin didn't come from Mars. It changed. I mean, a man comes and then changes the constitution. He literally changes the constitution. He does what he wants, and the Russian nation is okay with it. For 25 years, a quarter of a century, there was it's the Tsar. It's not the leader, and it's usurping power. I'm sorry, but you probably understood what I wanted to ask. I mean, the nation should be held accountable for having Putin in place and usurping power and changing constitution and doing so for 25 years in a row. Is that right thing?
I can certainly understand Ukrainian anger towards Russia. I haven't lived through what you've lived through for the past 15, 16 months. But remember, Putin did seize power. The Russians have at times tried to remove him and have been unsuccessful. So I think the Russians that support Putin, there's culpability there. But I don't think every Russian is to blame. I think it's the Russians who are supporting their evil czar, not everyone.
Well, I agree with you on that, but there are fears in Ukraine and in the world that after Putin leaves, whatever is the way that he's leaving, someone comes that is even worse. Because Russia is full of this high-ranked officials and KGB officers and you name them.
I agree that someone could be, we might get someone much worse, but I'm also very optimistic that this war is Putin's war. And the failure of the Russian military to take a country 1/3 of its size just looks so bad. The Ukrainian resistance looks so incredible. And this is, from the Russian perspective, a debacle, a catastrophe, a quagmire. Putin can't admit that, which causes problems ending the war. But anyone else who comes in can say, look, this was my predecessor's mistake, and now I want to end it, and I'm willing to offer the Ukrainians terms of basically unconditional Russian surrender.
I'm sorry for interrupting. Do you believe Prigozhin will do it? Do you think the Prigozhin will say, well, Putin has done a lot of mistakes, I really need to make it up to Ukraine for some reason? Or I think he's a monster. He will do even worse damage in Ukraine he fled to.
But it's not making it up to Ukraine. It's what is in the best interest of the new leader. Have the Russians gained anything in Ukraine? The Russians have overrun a few cities, a lot of farmers' fields in eastern Ukraine that is of very little value to the Russian state. They're taking tremendous casualties. If I were the new Russian leader, I would order all my tanks to drive east and over the Russian border and just end this and stop the bleeding.
Well, this is why you're not Russian leader, because they just don't care.
Perhaps. Yeah, I know you're making an excellent devil's advocate argument, but I don't see why any leader would want to keep up this costly war. Putin has a problem admitting he made a mistake, and that will make him look weak if he turns around. Any other leader can say, we're declaring victory and going home. They'll say to Zelenskyy, make some sort of conciliatory statement to us, say some pretty words, and we go home. And that'll be the end of it. They'll get some sort of statement, and they'll just turn those tanks east, is what I desperately hope.
But in terms of Prigozhin, PMC Wagner and others, they will be struggling for power in Russia to get closer to the throne, or maybe usurp another Putin's, if you like. So,
yeah, I think that there will be fights, and my Ukrainian, my grandmother was Ukrainian, and I regret to say I cannot speak Ukrainian very well, nor can I speak Russian very well. I think the term is what's the term for the security services in Russia? It starts with an S. I'm thinking of the KGB, the generals, the people who are immediately below Putin. They will, amongst themselves, fight it out. Those people will try to get into power. I just don't think it's going to break out into what we would deem a full-scale civil war. I think it would be more done with negotiations and occasionally possibly assassinations. I think it would be closer to how Khrushchev came to power than how Lenin came to power.
Yeah. And maybe there is a possibility that these guys will just put Putin on a plane and send him right to The Hague, right?
Maybe, but frankly, you don't want Putin to be alive if you want to run Russia. They'll shoot him in the head. They'll just shoot him in the head. Maybe they'll send his body to The Hague, but they don't want any possibility of Putin being around to do anything.
Putin's body in The Hague. That's so much. I love it. As an expert, as a person, as a person who has sort of roots in Ukraine, what would you wish the Ukrainian nation, to our fighters and to our civilians that are going through hard times today, these days?
I would say to the Ukrainian fighters, you men have more guts than anyone else I've ever seen. Your defense of Ukraine has been incredible. It's been inspiring. There are times that I almost cried thinking of your heroism. I salute you. To the Ukrainian people, I will say that this war will end. Ukraine will be victorious. there will be a better tomorrow.
Thank you very much from the bottom of my heart and probably from the bottom of the whole Ukrainian heart. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Slava Ukraine.
Slava Ukraine, Guram Slava. Thank you. Thank you for your time, for being with us. I am Henry Keane and it is my show, Talk for More, directly from Ukraine. Join the gaze online and feed your thirst for truth and adventure into the realm of international news and politics. Take care. See you soon.